All right, well, it is just after 3, and I want to welcome everyone who is currently on for our webinar today. My name is Marie Eagle, and I am the project coordinator for the ARC of Michigan. I want to thank you all for joining and welcome you to this webinar on behalf of the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services and the ARC of Michigan. The department is committed to providing ongoing support and guidance to our PAHP and CMHSP partners in order to establish and implement best practices across the state on a wide range of topics related to person-centered planning. The intent of these webinars is to share information and established best practices on person-centered planning, but not to provide individualized technical assistance. This month's topic is an overview of the HSW Waiver and will be presented by Rayanne Galarno and Tami Leto from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. So I do want to just remind participants of some brief housekeeping that all participants have been muted and videos are turned off. The chat function is also turned off, but any questions can be asked using the Q&A box to myself, Rayanne, or Tami. Following the webinar, all participants will receive a link to both the information provided today and a recording to today's session. So I am going to get this started and turn it over to Rayanne.
Great, thank you, Marie. Good afternoon and hello, everyone. Again, I am Rayanne Galarno. I am the Intellectual and Developmental Disability Specialist with Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities Administration within the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. I specifically work within the Division of Quality Management and Planning in the Federal Compliance section. I have a couple of different hats that I wear with the department, one of which is oversight of the Habilitation Supports Waiver, which includes the determining waiver eligibility for individuals. You can go to the next slide, please. So here's our agenda for this afternoon. I will be providing you with an overview of the Habilitation Supports Waiver Program, which is administered through the Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities Administration for persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The items that we will be spending time covering today are waiver basics, eligibility requirements, level of care requirements, the services that are available in the waiver, the initial enrollment on the waiver, known as a HSW certification, and the annual enrollment on the HSW, which is the HSW recertification. Advance to the next slide. So to begin, I'll talk a bit about behavioral health specialty services and supports. The Medicaid Home and Community-Based Services Waiver Program is authorized under Section 1915C of the Social Security Act. This authority allows Michigan to provide an array of home and community-based services that assist Medicaid beneficiaries to live in the community and to avoid institutionalization. So in addition to the 1915C authority, Michigan provides public mental health services through a variety of different authorities, as you can see on this slide. If you're interested, the link provides information on all the authorities for behavioral health services. But of course, today's focus is on the Habilitation Supports Waiver, which is one of 3 of our 1915C waivers. The other 2 C waivers are the Children's Waiver Program and the Serious Emotional Disturbance Waiver. Next slide, please. So in Michigan, specialty behavioral health services are provided through prepaid inpatient health plans referred to as PAHPs, which are made up of community mental health service programs. Within our state, there are 10 prepaid inpatient health plans, and these 10 PAHPs are represented by the color variations as shown on this map. So HSW eligibility requirements. To be enrolled on the Habilitation Supports Waiver, there are eligibility requirements which must be met. Those eligibility requirements are captured here on the slide. They include all of the following. An individual must have a developmental disability. There is no age restriction or requirement to be enrolled. The individual must live in a community setting. So if the person lives in a licensed setting, such as a specialized group home, that setting must hold a license for 12 beds or less to be considered a community setting. The person must be eligible for and enrolled on Medicaid. The individual would otherwise need the level of services similar to services in an intermediate care facility for individuals with intellectual disabilities, which is an institutional setting. The individual must choose to participate in the HSW in lieu of services provided in an institutional setting, that ICF-IID. And the individual must receive at least one habilitative service each month once enrolled. So I'll spend some time with the next several slides talking about the ICF-IID, the institutional level of care requirement. So a bit of history. When originally approved in October of 1987, the Habilitation Supports Waiver was Michigan's primary vehicle for reducing its use of intermediate care facilities for individuals with intellectual disabilities by allowing a set of strategic long-term services and supports to be delivered in community settings. This ICF-IID, or institutional level of care eligibility requirement, must be determined by a qualified intellectual disability professional, also referred to as a QIDP. The key components for determining this level of care are, does a person need training that are similar to what a person with an intellectual or developmental disability or a related condition would need to improve skills and independence in personal skills or adaptive behaviors? And are person's needs attributed to the presence of an intellectual and developmental disability? So it's important to note that the ICF-IID level of care, or that institutional level of care, does not include services to support generally independent beneficiaries who are able to function with little supervision or in the absence of an active treatment program. Next slide, please. So the level of care requirement is specified in the Code of Federal Regulations, which states for HSW eligibility, an individual must meet the institutional level of care requirement, that ICF-IID requirement. This means that if HSW services are not provided in the community, the person would need an active treatment program of specialized and/or generic training, treatment, health and related services directed towards acquisition of behaviors necessary to function with as much self-determination and independence as possible. So again, the purpose of HSW is to provide community-based services to people with an intellectual or developmental disability who, if not for the availability and provision of HSW services, would otherwise require the level of care of services in an intermediate care facility for individuals with intellectual disabilities, or that institutional level of care. The Code of Federal Regulations also specifies guidance for active treatment, which includes the need for training, which targets the amelioration of those most basic skill deficit areas as a critical component of an active treatment program needed by persons eligible for the ICF-IID benefit, that institutionalization benefit, and is therefore a required ICF-IID service. So this speaks to the intensity of need of the individual. So the goal for HSW is to enable people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who have significant needs and who meet all the eligibility requirements to live and fully participate in their communities. Next slide, please. So additional federal guidance stipulates that active treatment, again, does not include services to maintain generally independent individuals who are able to function with little supervision or in the absence of a continuous active treatment program. So what does this all mean? So HSW now functions as the state's primary vehicle for supporting people in the community by enrolling people who were placed out of institutional settings and deflecting those who might otherwise require an institutional level of care. Next slide, thank you. So HSW Services. On this slide, you can see a list of all services available under the waiver. Persons enrolled on the Habilitation Supports Waiver have access to any of these services as medical necessity criteria is met. It's important to note that the first 4 services listed, the community living supports, out-of-home non-vocational habilitation, pre-vocational services, and supported employment, are the habilitative services under the waiver. By the very nature of the definition of habilitation and the service descriptions, these are the key services that support a habilitative need that an individual may have. So I will spend some time talking about these 4 services on the next slide, but wanted to take a moment to provide a brief description of the other covered services under the waiver. So following supported employment is respite care. Respite is care services to provide an intermediate and periodic break for the primary caregiver. Overnight health and safety supports are services to enhance a person's safety and independence with an awake staff supervising the health and welfare of a beneficiary overnight. I will note that these services are not available when the need is medical in nature or when it is in anticipation of a medical emergency. The need is more to prevent or mitigate mental health or disability related behaviors. Fiscal intermediary services are also a covered service under the waiver, and this is a service for individuals using self-directed arrangements to manage individual budgets and payroll. Non-family training. This is the coaching and training and supervision of support staff, such as community living supports or respite staff. Family training. This is training by a professional on a need that may be around a specific piece of equipment or a supports plan that an individual may have. Goods and services. This service is available to those in self-directed arrangements to replace the need for a person to increase independence. So examples may be include an automatic door opener or a device to control someone's environment, such as smart technology, or perhaps a service animal. The next service is Personal Emergency Response Systems, or PERS. So this is an electronic device that allows beneficiaries to secure help in the event of an emergency, somewhat similar to that of a lifeline system that you may be familiar with. Private duty nursing is also a benefit under the waiver. This is skilled nursing interventions provided to individuals who are 21 and older to meet health needs that are directly related to that developmental disability. Enhanced medical equipment and supplies. These are items that are beyond what Medicaid may cover, such as a specialty blender for a specific diet texture, perhaps, or adaptations to vehicles. Environmental modifications. This includes things such as ramps, grab bars, widening of doorways, bathroom modifications. And lastly, we have enhanced pharmacy. So this is physician-ordered non-prescription medicine chest type items, such as cold and cough medications, vitamins, thickening agents, perhaps, and first aid supplies. Next slide, please. So the habilitative services, these are the 4 services that are specific to the habilitative component and the requirement for HSW eligibility. So the first is community living supports. This is a service that is staff support to work on independence. This is the teaching and training of skills for the beneficiary. Next, we have out-of-home non-vocational habilitation. This is a program that's outside of the home to increase skills and socialization, and again, which includes the teaching and training and skill development for a beneficiary. Pre-vocational services are services directed towards the development of job skills that contribute to competitive employment. And the final service is supported employment. These are services to help people obtain competitive work in the community. So just to reiterate, the use of a habilitative service is required for eligibility to meet that habilitative need that an individual may have. Next slide, please. The iSpa. So with the next few slides, I'll talk a little bit about coordination of benefits. So people who are enrolled on the Habilitation Supports Waiver are also eligible for enrollment in the 1915 iSpa or the state plan amendment. The iSpa benefit is not limited to the intellectual and developmental disabilities population. All individuals receiving behavioral health services who meet the iSpa eligibility requirements may be enrolled. The iSpa eligibility requirements are not as stringent as HSW requirements. There's not that institutional level of care need. Remembering HSW serves only people with an intellectual or a developmental disability who meet that higher institutional level of care. So here's a list of benefits included in the iSpa, the state plan amendment. These may look familiar as many of these services were in the former B3 service array. Services included our community living supports, environmental modifications, family support and training, fiscal intermediary, respite, skill building, vehicle modifications. And again, if an HSW beneficiary is in need of any of these services, they would be eligible for these services as well if they meet requirements. Next slide, please. So the Habilitation Supports Waiver operates concurrently with Michigan's 1115 Behavioral Health Demonstration as a managed care program. So people enrolled in the Habilitation Supports Waiver are eligible for any medically necessary services through the state plan service array. However, other Medicaid beneficiaries not enrolled in HSW cannot receive HSW services. So Medicaid state plan benefit is where you would find the case management benefit, which includes supports coordination within the service description. Services that are exclusive to the HSW only are private duty nursing for individuals who are 21 and over, goods and services for those in self-directed arrangements, and out-of-home non-vocational habilitation. Next slide, please. So here is the list of state plan benefits. This is where you would find services such as assessments, individual therapy, medication review, clinical services such as occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy, Again, the targeted case management, where supports coordination now lives, and treatment planning. Next slide, please. So the Medicaid Provider Manual is the resource for service descriptions. I have included the address here, which is also a link. You can find information on the Habilitation Supports Waiver under the Behavioral Health and Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Supports and Services chapter. The Habilitation Supports Waiver is described in section 15, and state plan services are described in section 3. I will mention, however, that currently our Medicaid Provider Manual is under construction and may not yet reflect all the changes that were noted today. So moving on to HSW certification or enrollment. Michigan has a specific number of HSW slots that are approved by CMS or by Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services per each fiscal year. So Michigan has just under 8,000 slots at 7,902. The assignment of slots is managed by the state. Each prepaid inpatient health plan has an annual allocation of active enrollments. So they have an annual allocation of slots that cannot be exceeded. And there were 3 priority populations for filling these slots. The first is children who are aging off of the Children's Waiver Program. The second is people who are determined to be at high risk for institutionalization, or that ICF ID. And the third group are people age 21 and older who need private duty nursing and meet HSW eligibility. So the process to apply for the Habilitation Supports Waiver begins with the prepaid inpatient health plan. The PIHP completes an enrollment request packet that's submitted to the department, in which several pieces of documentation are required. This includes a Habilitation Supports Waiver certification form with the required sections fully completed with signatures and dates. A completed level of care, which is part of establishing that institutional level of care requirement and need. A signed individual plan of service, including the amount, scope, and duration of each service needed. And if the beneficiary is under 26 years of age and still in receiving educational services, then an individual educational plan would also be required. And any other supporting documentation, such as evaluations or professional notes, which would support the need for enrollment on the HSW. So a bit about the individual plan of service. The plan of service must identify the need for HSW services. The plan must include measurable goals that identify skill acquisition for the beneficiary, the habilitative service that will assist that beneficiary in meeting those goals. And it should be a agreed upon and signed plan by the beneficiary and or the guardian. So if the prepaid inpatient health plan has an available slot, an enrollment request is initiated to the state. Once the department receives the packet, review is completed for the enrollment, and a decision is made on whether the person meets all of the eligible criteria for HSW. So if the information supports the need for HSW services and the PIHP has an available slot, then the department will enroll the person and issue an approval to the PIHP. So why do we do annual recertification? So enrolling in the HSW is for a one-year period. It is not for a lifetime. This is why each beneficiary's enrollment is reviewed annually. In 2019, a change occurred to the recertification process with our newly approved waiver. Recertification of a case could no longer be completed by the CMH or by the PAHP. The annual recertification process was moved to the state to review each enrollment and recertify each case within the 365-day time period. Next slide. Oh, okay, so this brings us to the end of the presentation. I have included here contact information for the HSW team, which includes myself, again, Rayanne Galarno, Lindia Dramedy as the manager of the federal compliance section, as well as Tami, Leto, and Lori Caputo, who are also a part of the HSW team as well. So I think we can see if there's any questions.
I'm going to reminder to participants that if you would like to ask a question, if you could please type it into the chat. We may not be able to answer every question today, but depending on the question, if we're not able to answer a question that you have here, if you have a specific information need, you can certainly reach out to me and we will direct you in the right area following the presentation. Rayanne, I did have a question come up asking, you stated that if the PAHP has an open slot, then the enrollment will start, or it will be submitted. What if they don't have an open slot? What happens to that application?
So the person, that application would be held until a slot is available. The PAHP does have to prioritize who within their region is in most need. The benefits within the ISPA are very similar benefits to the HSW, and there would be an expectation that the supports and services that are needed for that individual would be able to continue and be provided through those ISPA benefits.
Thank you. We also had a question asking if this waiver works in relation to someone living in the parent's home with the parent providing services.
So the waiver's intent, of course, is to provide those supports in community setting and in individuals' home, parents' homes, those types of settings. There is the requirement, however, that a habilitative service must be utilized to provide supports to that person. So there would be consideration of whether one of those 4 habilitative supports, or excuse me, services are in place. So the community living supports, the out-of-home non-vocational, habilitation, pre-vocational supports, or supported employment. A service would need to be in place to establish that active treatment need.
Okay, thank you. There's also a question about pre-vocational supports, and if you would be able to provide examples of how that service could be used.
So I think, back up to the slide here. So those pre-vocational supports, of course, are learning and work experiences, right? That a beneficiary can develop general, non-specific tasks to strengthen skills that contribute to an individual's competitive employment. So I would look at potentially a volunteer situation, perhaps, for an individual. trying to think of some other kind of very non-specific areas. Tami, would you have any thoughts?
Sorry. No, I think you covered it. I mean, without going into something specific.
If the person who asked that question has any more specifics, please feel free to the questions to drop those into the chat. So in general, Ryan, if somebody did have questions about a service on the waiver that they think that they may qualify for, would like to explore more, what would you suggest who they talk to?
So certainly, you know, that conversation should begin with your service provider working with you, your case manager, supports coordinator, of course. There should also be resources at the community mental health with persons that can assist if there's any sort of dispute over availability of a service. There's also resources within the prepaid inpatient health plan within a region. Each region has an identified habilitation supports waiver coordinator that assists with overseeing waiver obligations and services within their regions.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if that answers the question.
I hope so. I'm sure we'll find out if not. Okay, I have to catch up with questions real quick. So there's a question asking why because there are such similar supports provided between the HSW and the 1915I waivers, why would a person need the HSW, or what would be the deciding factor for why they would apply for that and not utilize the other supports?
It is about, you know, that level of care requirement, right? So HSW does have that active treatment component that also has an intensity of service involvement for the beneficiary. So there are some slight variations in service descriptions and eligibility within the I-SPY and the HSW. However, Michigan did decide to try to make services very similar, so that if a beneficiary without that level of care needed a service, that it would still be available and to be provided to them.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm just waiting to see if there are more questions coming through. And again, I want to remind people, if we don't get to your specific question, it may be that we want to provide you with some more specifics than we can in this overview webinar. And we'll be following up with you post webinar. I'm not seeing any more questions come through. Do either of you ladies have anything that you would like to add before we end?
I want to thank you for the invitation and having us present today. And I hope the information, the overview was helpful for people in understanding the HSW and the benefits that it's offered.
Okay, we do have one more question before we jump off. There's a question: if parents are being paid through DHS Does that preclude HSW? My assumption would be DHS through maybe the home help program is what they mean. If not, please clarify that, but that's the question that we have right now.
Yeah, so no, that is a separate benefit. So that home help benefit is more about hands-on care and tasks that are completed for an individual. And HSW eligibility is more about that teaching and training of skills. So accessing that home help benefit absolutely does not preclude HSW enrollment.
Okay, thank you. And I believe there is just one more question that I want to make sure I get to. Asking if someone applies for the habilitative support waiver and is not approved, or there are not slots available, should there be any concern that they would not receive the same level of support or a lower level of support while they wait for that approval to come through, or maybe a slot to open up?
There should not be a concern. If there is a denial of a submission of a packet or a determination that the individual was not eligible, there would be an appeal process. Certainly that a beneficiary would have access to if there is a disagreement with that decision. But I would say in general, needs should continue to be met through the other services that are available through both state plan benefits and through the iSPA.
Great, thank you. We're also having questions asking if there is any plain language material available to describe the waiver that people could provide to individuals and families.
I think that's a really great question. I would believe that the PAHPs should have some plain language information drafted, but I think that is a good consideration for Tami and I to take back and consider about possibly a department a form or something that we could create that would also be useful. So I think that may be a great suggestion.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, I am not seeing any additional questions. If someone did not have a chance to ask their question or has something more specific, again, please feel free to reach out following the webinar. Otherwise, I want to thank both of you again for presenting today. We appreciate your time and knowledge, and remind all participants that you will receive a link to a recording of today's presentation along with a PDF of the slide deck that was presented. So we thank everyone again and hope to see you next month.
Thank you, Marie.